Hi, I'm David Manti, and with me today is Morgan Fox with the National Cannabis Industry Association. Thank you very much for joining me today, Morgan.
Thanks for having me.
So let's get started. It was a crazy election week, a great week for the cannabis industry. Tell me a little bit about what you saw.
Well, on election night, 5 states voted on either medical or adult use initiatives, and they passed in all 5 states, some of them by really resounding margins. Just to go through the list, Arizona, Montana, New Jersey, and South Dakota all passed adult use initiatives. South Dakota also passed a medical initiative, and Mississippi passed a medical initiative that was actually far better than an alternative one that was introduced by lawmakers in an attempt to split the vote. So, really across the board, it was a really great day for cannabis policy reform, not just in those states, but across the country for a couple of reasons. I mean, one, that 5 new markets are going to be opening up soon, and the lawmakers that represent those states are now going to be representing legal states in Congress. So we're looking at, for adult use representation, 29 more representatives and 8 more senators. That doesn't guarantee they'll vote in favor of cannabis policy reform on the Hill, but it definitely helps swing the scales in that favor. And the fact that initiatives like New Jersey passed by 2/3 of the voting population in that state, which is 10% more than the next most popular legalization initiative since they started happening in 2012. So I think that all of these are great indicators that things are moving in the right direction for cannabis policy reform.
Now, let's talk about next steps. For people that are looking to get into these new markets, what do they do next?
Well, all of these states have to do some sort of regulatory development over the next few months. Some of the initiatives were a little bit more exact in what they actually approved than others, but all of them are going to take some work by regulators and legislators to come up with the framework for how those systems are going to work, which means that now is the time to get involved in state level lobbying and advocacy efforts to make sure that these regulations are not overly restrictive, to make sure that the tax rates are reasonable and allow businesses to compete with the underground market, as well as to make sure that these systems are implemented in a fair manner that creates opportunities for everybody, and in particular, people that have been disproportionately harmed by the war on drugs.
So, from some of the policies that you've seen in previous states, what are some of the things that you hope they change and some of the things that they use going forward?
Well, I think that some of them have already instituted license caps, like Arizona, but they're at least somewhat fluid and based on some other factors like representation in certain markets of medical dispensaries as well as pharmacies, et cetera. But some of the states have an opportunity to move forward with systems that do not necessarily have license caps, and that will keep competition in the market instead of in the licensing process, which tends to favor people that have a lot of access to capital, as well as creating the potential for corruption with city officials that can say yes or no on these issues, or even at the state level. And we don't see a lot of that, but it does introduce that element into the licensing system, and that's something that we clearly like to avoid. Having these sort of limited licensing schemes really sets the barrier of entry pretty high and makes it insurmountable for a lot of people.
One of the things that I found interesting was that with this election, more than a third of the country now has access to legal cannabis. What are your thoughts on that? Did you think that we would be here at this point? Are we kind of ahead of where you thought we'd be, or are we behind?
Well, honestly, I think that things have been moving apace, considering the rate at which they've actually increased. I'm used to really just like losing a lot of battles and then finally winning them after 3 or 4 tries. I've been doing this since 2008, and now the wind is really at our backs. So, I mean, I never like to make exact predictions about what could happen. If you had talked to me at the end of last year, I would have said that we can probably expect a lot more incremental changes happening in terms of standalone cannabis policy legislation, and a whole lot more discussion in Congress about more comprehensive reforms, including the potential for more votes on larger and more broader bills. But no one could have predicted the pandemic happening. there are all sorts of other factors that you never really know exactly how they're going to impact cannabis policy reform. Changes in the electorate, changes in the makeup of Congress, all of these things have a factor. So it's really difficult to try to guess at where things are going to be in the future. But what we do know is that momentum has never been stronger for reform. And, now we just have to wait and see what the outcome is going to be for the Senate to determine exactly how fast cannabis policy reform can move in the next legislature, as well as what types of bills are more likely to be considered.
So, from a personal experience, what was it like on election nights? Personally, for me, I was, as I'm watching Twitter, it's a tale of two different elections. Absolute jubilation on the cannabis side of business and dread and confusion on the other. So could you tell me a little bit about what your experience was on election night?
Honestly, it was very reminiscent of what happened in 2016.
Yeah.
It was, it's good knowing that no matter how divisive politics gets in this country, that there's at least one issue that people appear to be rallying around. And it might come as a surprise to some people, but it's not coming as a surprise to me and to other advocates because the facts are on our side. And it really just takes reaching those voters. And once you really explain the issues and get rid of a lot of the misinformation that people have been absorbing over the past decades, and take away some of the insecurity that people might feel by showing them what effective regulated cannabis programs look like, the support for this just continues to grow and grow. So, honestly, I think that it's a sign that this is an issue that is going to continue moving at an increasing pace, and one that presents an opportunity for nonpartisan cooperation across all political ideologies.
So you didn't see any particular partisan split from state to state in terms of support?
Well, if you look at the polling, Democrats continue to support cannabis policy reform in by greater percentages than Republicans do. But the most recent Gallup polls from last year actually show that Republicans, actually, a majority of them do support legalization. It's a slim majority, but it's a majority nonetheless. And when you break it down by age demographics, younger voters in particular have much greater levels of support because they're more familiar with the subject. They have better sources of information, and they haven't grown up with the stigma of reefer madness that a lot of older voters and older politicians, for that matter, have absorbed over the years. So, I think that, like I said, the fact that these measures passed in deeply conservative states this time around should come as a wake-up call for conservative lawmakers in particular, that not only isn't this an issue that is gaining popularity among their base, but it's one that could create serious political consequences if they stand in the way of. In particular, you look at South Dakota, for instance. It's the first state ever to institute an adult use initiative without already having a medical initiative in place. And this happened in a conservative, fairly rural state. I think that that's a huge indicator of how far we've come on this issue.
What are the next states that you're hoping to target or flip?
Well, I think that New Jersey is going to have a huge regional impact. States like New York, Pennsylvania, Connecticut, Delaware, Rhode Island, and even Maryland have all been considering legalization legislation over the past couple of years and getting closer and closer to actually passing it. Now that a regional linchpin like New Jersey, with such a huge population and proximity to all of these markets, is going to be implementing a regulated adult use cannabis program, I think we're going to see the urgency to pass something similar in order to not miss out on job creation and tax revenue that comes with regulated markets is just going to skyrocket. And I think we can definitely expect to see legislation moving much more quickly in those states in the coming sessions. With regard to ballot initiatives, the pandemic was unfortunately stymied the ability of several states to be able to move forward with initiative campaigns for this year. Places like Nebraska, Arkansas, Idaho, Oklahoma, Missouri, all these states were unable to really run campaigns the way that they needed to in order to get on the ballot. And some of them were forced to give up. In the case of Nebraska, the ballot initiative was pulled by a legal challenge immediately after it got on the ballot. So I think we can expect to see campaigns in those states in 2022 or 2024. There may be a number of other states that start looking at either expanding into adult use from existing medical programs, or looking at medical programs for the first time. But we're really running out of states where the ballot initiative process exists in order to be able to push these to the voters, where they've always done much better than they have in state legislatures.
You talk about how the pandemic affected the industry from the regulatory side, but how has it affected the business? From what I've heard, some people have noticed that capital spending has dropped off, while some of the other companies haven't really noticed much of a dip at all.
Capital investment has been pretty low,
Mhm.
but sales have been up almost across the board, and largely because consumers are much less likely to do business with the unregulated market when we're in an area, a place where health concerns and safety concerns are paramount. Um, there are also, I think, a lot of people are looking for alternatives to alcohol for relaxation during the pandemic, which cannabis is clearly objectively safer than alcohol. So people are making a lot of public health decisions that have been benefiting the industry, and the industry has been responding wonderfully. As an industry that changes constantly, it's very nimble and was able to respond to the challenges posed by the pandemic really effectively. But at the same time, the fact that these businesses have such high levels of taxation, they're not allowed to deduct federal expenses on their federal taxes. They have very limited access to banking and financial services, even more limited access to capital, and no access to things like PPP and SBA loans that other legitimate businesses are able to access. Has really put a strain on the industry. So, despite the fact that it's been able to continue operating in every state, during the pandemic as either an essential business or just otherwise allowed to continue operating. And even despite the fact that sales are up, a lot of these businesses are hurting. Uh, I think that going forward, the industry is in a pretty good position politically because of the recognition of them as essential healthcare service providers and job creators. Um, but the financial strains of the pandemic, if they last much longer without federal assistance, could be really problematic.
Talking about banking, while there has been sort of a groundswell of support for legalization, I don't think that people understand the challenges that some of these companies run into from a banking perspective. Could you talk a little bit about some of the challenges that some of these manufacturers and other companies run into as a result of restrictions when it comes to banking and financing?
Well, there are an increasing number of banks and credit unions that are willing to work with the cannabis industry, although from time to time that does drop. It's been steady at around 450 or so financial institutions that are filing reports with the Treasury Department that they are working with these cannabis businesses. And there are a number of non traditional service providers that are trying to help find solutions to working in a cash only environment. But it's the cannabis industry is still really, really underserved by financial institutions, and it continues to create health and safety problems, not just the ones that existed before the pandemic, associated with having large amounts of cash on hand and being targets for crime, but now the issues of transferring contagion via cash and people with uh, immunocompromised medical issues. They don't want to have to do in-person cash transactions, and it creates a public safety issue and a public health issue for them. Um, I think that we can continue to see these problems exist until federal banking reform is passed when it comes to cannabis, and we are hopeful that we will be able to get that language included in any future pandemic stimulus package, provided that Congress can actually agree on one. The safe banking language that was included in the House passed relief package, and that was also introduced in by the Democrats for a separate Senate package, is revenue neutral and pretty much non-contentious, despite what some lawmakers might be saying on Twitter to get some more clicks and follows. It's not really an issue. So I think that we're in a good place to see that included in future relief packages, as long as Congress can come to an agreement on one. Um, Depending on what happens with the Senate, we might be able to address it in pretty short order as a standalone bill in the coming session, if it does not pass in a pandemic relief package. But I think that that might be a little bit more difficult depending on what the makeup of Congress is going forward, because one of the biggest champions in the Senate, Cory Gardner, has lost his reelection bid to former Colorado Governor John Hickenlooper.
You talk about tax revenue, and some of the conversations that I've had with people in the industry, there's been some people are upset with how the tax revenues have been used. Some people would like to see more of it reinvested for, better regulation over worker safety and things like that. What is your perspective on how tax revenue generated by the industry is used, not necessarily to help the industry, but sometimes for other budgetary shortfalls?
Well, I think that the taxation situation is different in every state. In general, cannabis taxes pay entirely for all of the operating costs and regulatory costs associated with operating the system. But what is done with the leftovers, there's a really wide variety of plans that states have instituted. I know that recently there has been a lot more attention paid to cannabis taxes going to police departments, when a lot of people in the cannabis community have really viewed prohibition and the fact that prohibition laws and laws making marijuana illegal have always been disproportionately enforced in communities of color and economically depressed areas. And so using cannabis taxes to fund the same people who have been committing these abuses is really contrary to what advocates in many cases have wanted for these systems. There's also not nearly enough reinvestment in the communities that have been most harmed by the war on drugs, regardless of what that looks like. So, I know that we've heard complaints about not enough of the tax revenue going to improving existing cannabis programs, but really a lot of the impetus for that should be on the industry itself and operating under best practices. If there are ways to reduce the regulatory costs associated with doing that, I think that that's probably a much better option than using cannabis taxes to try to pay for programs to improve the existing industry. Just let them save the money and do it themselves.
So your big trade show is this week, but as a result of the pandemic, everything's gone digital. Could you tell me a little bit about your expectations for the show this year, now that it is a cyber event?
Well, I've always enjoyed the in-person ones. It's a great way to network, but the system that we have set up is going to allow for a lot of online networking that we hope will fill that gap very effectively. We've got the same incredible lineup of speakers and experts that we've always had. Our keynotes are going to be amazing. Former presidential candidate Andrew Yang and musician Carlos Santana are going to be speaking with some of our moderators and speakers. I think it's going to be a really great event, despite not being able to be held in person. And I think people have gotten used to that. That being said, we can't wait to hold them in person again next year.
So you do think next year is feasible in terms of a in-person trade show?
Fingers crossed. We're going to continue to monitor the situation and follow whatever guidelines are set out by the CDC and the whatever local governments are responsible for that area.
Okay, well, I'm sure it's been a busy week for you. So when do you get to take a break?
There's no rest for the wicked. After this week, we've got the conference coming up next week, as you mentioned, and then despite the fact that it's going to be a lame duck session, we're very hopeful that the House will bring the MORE Act for a vote, which would call for descheduling and restorative justice measures, and as well as additional research. So, we're very hopeful that we can get that passed through the House during the lame duck session, because it would put us in a really, really good footing for the next legislative session, regardless of the outcome of this election.
I apologize for not starting with this, but could you tell us a little bit more about NCIA, who your members are, who you represent, and what you guys do?
We're the nation's oldest and largest cannabis policy or cannabis trade organization. We have between 1,000 and 2,000 members at any given time, and always trying to expand. but basically, we're primarily a federal lobbying organization in terms of what our policy advocacy efforts are, trying to end prohibition and help the government develop regulations that are sensible and protect public safety, but also aren't overly burdensome on the industry, and working to create a fair and opportunity-filled environment for the legal cannabis industry in this country. We also are a traditional trade organization. We provide resources and additional benefits to our members to help them operate their businesses in the most effective and best possible fashion. And then, we also have a lot of events throughout the year that have gone digital this year, but will hopefully be in person again very soon. But now that we, like a lot of other organizations, have really gotten a taste for creating digital content and being able to reach people without some of the costs associated with physical events, I think that we're going to be bringing back our physical events in addition to a lot of the digital content that we've been producing so far.
Okay. Do you need to be in a state or area where cannabis is legalized, or can anyone become a member?
No, as long as you pay your membership dues and can abide by the code of conduct that we set out, then anybody can be a member of NCIA in any state and in any business, whether it's plant touching or ancillary. In fact, I think only about 30% of our business members are plant touching, and the rest are all ancillary businesses that provide services for the cannabis industry. So one of the great things about this industry is that it's created so many opportunities in not just plant touching businesses, but in any field you can possibly imagine.
One of the things I always like to ask is, what are your expectations for the future? When it comes to 1 year out, 5 years out, what do you think is possible when it comes to federal legalization?
Well, I think that regardless of what happens, our plan is going to be the same, just continuing to work with lawmakers on both sides of the aisle to convince them of the facts of prohibition, that these policies are a failure, they're creating conflicts with the states, and that we as a society are ready to regulate cannabis in a manner similarly to alcohol. Um, the only difference will be how quickly those efforts pay off. Um, Over the next year, I think that we can continue to see uh, incremental measures pass pretty quickly, and a lot of continued debate on more comprehensive measures. Hopefully, we'll be able to get something passed next year in both chambers. That just being optimistic. Um, I think over the next 5 years, depending on what happens in the makeup of Congress, we can see some real serious reform, both in terms of descheduling, but also in terms of implementing effective regulations through organizations like the FDA and the Alcohol and Tobacco Tax and Trade Bureau.
Well, thank you very much for taking the time today, Morgan. I really
Oh,
do
thanks for having me
appreciate
on
it.
anytime.
I know that you're a busy guy, and I just wanted to ask, is there anything else that we left out or anything in particular that you want to make sure we cover today?
Well, I mean, I think that it's really important to remember that, economic opportunities aside, these efforts are also about justice. Just in the four adult use states that passed initiatives on Tuesday, collectively, they're responsible for roughly 60,000 arrests per year for cannabis, most of them for simple possession. So the
Mhm.
fact that we're going to see a drastic reduction in those over the next couple of years is, a really wonderful thing to see. And particularly looking at Arizona, where they were responsible for around 15,000 of those annual arrests, and Arizona currently considers even simple possession a felony. So it's the first state to actually jump from having possession be a felony to possession be legal. I mean, that's going to change a lot of people's lives. And when it comes down to it, that's, as an industry representative, we have to look out for the consumers too, but not just the consumers, but for the rights of people who are choosing to use this substance.
Is that actually I did want to ask you about that. Are previous convictions being wiped out after legalization happens in the state?
It's different for every state.
Yeah.
I think it just shows you how far this issue has come, because during the campaign for the early bills in Colorado, a lot of the polling suggested that having things like automatic expungement or retroactive amnesty would kill the chances of legalization passing. And you fast forward just a short 8 years, and now they're a necessary component of these discussions. I think that shows a real evolution of the public in terms of their knowledge and recognition of the fact that cannabis prohibition has ruined people's lives, and that this is really a social justice issue in addition to a freedom issue, or an economic issue, or a public safety issue. There are really negative outcomes that have a lot of branches and spread. Every time you arrest somebody for cannabis, it not just affects them, but their entire community, and affects their abilities to be productive members of society going forward. I think it's really important that we don't lose sight of that as these laws are passed, but every state has a different process. And so I think it's incumbent upon advocates to make sure that we streamline those processes and make them as easy on people as possible, as well as to try to make efforts at the federal level to provide funding for state programs, as well as to expunge federal charges. Even though they're a small percentage of the overall arrest rates and people that are being arrested for cannabis charges, it's still important. The sentencing tends to be much worse at the federal level. So those are individuals who are suffering really draconian consequences for relatively safe and responsible behavior.
Right, and I can't imagine the frustration as they see the industry moving forward and they seemingly feel left behind.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you very much for your time this week, Morgan. I really do appreciate it. For Cannabis Equipment News, I'm David Manti, and we'll see you next week.